Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Water's Edge, where the band just did a really powerful job of living out our mission of connecting God and people wherever they are. I don't know about you, but this has been a week for me, just watching on TV or on the computer screens, the tablet or phone, all the news going on, that I felt a need for a mercy and a love that is really wide, really deep, really strong, really high, because, man, it's been a week, hasn't it? We left here last Sunday with me putting out the proposition that if we think we can control the circumstances of our lives, we are in an illusion. It just doesn't work that way. And then Monday came, and tragically, and I do mean tragically, the events of the last week have really profoundly illustrated that point. Innocent people watching or running in the Boston Marathon find themselves blown apart by homemade bombs, and that's just the start of the week. We go a little further in, and the people down in a small town called West in Texas, outside of Waco, wake up one day to a fire in the local fertilizer factory, and that evening it explodes with a force so strong that literally the U.S. Geological Survey registers it as an earthquake. They still don't know how many people have died in that event. Or take a look at the political life. Whatever your opinion on one side or the other of the issue, our government has been talking and discussing and debating and going back and forth on the notion of gun control, and the president has put all of his esteem and the power of his position into it and went down to defeat on, I believe it was Wednesday, and was, as they say, a political earthquake. A whole lot's gone on, and even as the week raced to an end, we had the incredible storms and the flooding in Chicago or in Grand Rapids or parts of Michigan. Some of those floodwaters still not scheduled to crest until tomorrow, so people are still battling that. And then I don't know if you're like me, but I woke up early Friday morning and was absolutely riveted. The entire city of Boston, the first time I've ever seen anything like this in my life, an entire American city ground to a halt because one guy who was desperate. It's been that kind of week. So we learned a tough lesson this week that I guess we need to be reminded now and then is no matter how much we think we can control the circumstances of our lives, the world has a way of just butting in. So much happened that we didn't even pick up on some of the stories out there that in any other week would have been major news events. Remember 2 weeks ago, all the talk about North Korea? They're continuing preparations for a missile launch. They've actually moved some of their mobile missiles toward the coast in preparation for it. Nobody noticed that this last week. The U.S. sent an envoy over to China to talk to the Chinese about a variety of things, but most importantly about all the cyber attacks on American business and American government and American infrastructure that have been coming out of China. And the Chinese premier said, "We don't know what you're talking about." And so a war in cyberspace is now coming to reality, at least the very fringes of it. And then there was another story that on any other day except Wednesday, which was so heavy with news, probably would have been the top of the news and would have gone on for 2 or 3 days. It's a political story about a guy named Mark Sanford. The guy is the former governor of South Carolina. Back 5 years ago, he was a rising star in his personal political party. Talented, smart as a whip, smooth governor, smooth politician, was able to connect with people across a variety of political spectrums, well-liked and well-respected even by his rivals. People talked about him 5 years ago as a potential nominee for President of the United States. And then, right at the height of his power, when he was governor of South Carolina, he said, "I'm taking a vacation, a a personal vacation. I'm going to go hike the Appalachian Trail for 2 weeks. Does anybody remember this story, or did you catch part of it on Wednesday? He supposedly goes hiking the Appalachian Trail, something I've always wanted to do. But instead of going on the trail, he goes to Argentina, where he had met a woman a few months earlier and has an illicit affair with her. It comes out in the news, comes out to the family. His wife divorces. The family is shattered. He's humiliated. His poll numbers plummet. He resigns as governor of South Carolina. And everybody says, Mark Sanford is done. And then a few weeks ago, he runs for an open seat for the House of Representatives from South Carolina and wins the nomination of his particular political party. And everybody says, he's back. Mark Sanford is back. Now, we're not talking politics today. We're talking a story that illustrates our primary point. He's made a comeback. He's put his life back together. Or has he? Mark Sanford, his ex-wife, just last Wednesday, she filed a suit against him, saying that he had broken the bonds of their divorce decree by trespassing on their former home where she now lives. And immediately he came out and he said, it's all understandable. I mean, my son was home alone. It was Super Bowl Sunday. So yes, she wasn't around. I came over. I watched the second half of the Super Bowl because I just didn't want my son being alone. He wants to be a good dad. There's a reason for this, we say. Until you read the paperwork that she filed, where she highlights that he's done this since the divorce over 50 times. Snuck into the house just to check on the kids. They've come down for breakfast in the morning. He's sitting at the breakfast table like nothing had ever happened. His political party dropped him, and now who knows whether he'll make it through the election or not. This is a guy who had it all. A hair's breadth away from the presidency of the United States. All he had to do was exercise a little self-control and set some boundaries. And even after he failed once, he had the opportunity to put it all back together. And he couldn't control himself. And that's our point for today. A few weeks ago we said we try to control the people around us and we can't. Last week we said we try to control our circumstances and we can't. Today we're going to talk about how we control ourselves, or do we? And there's a bit of scripture I'm going to be pulling up for you. It comes from Romans, the 7th chapter. And I want you to read along with me on the screen as it comes up, because it's a very profound translation we have this morning. Paul is the writer. He is this great follower of Jesus, the evangelist who did more to really explode the church in its early days than anybody else. And now he's writing this theological treatise to the Romans about how they are freed from the Old Testament law to live lives following God's Spirit and the teachings of Christ and believing in Christ. And he's acknowledged right up through the first 6.5 chapters, this is hard work. He gets this is hard work. And then as he comes to the end of the 7th chapter, he suddenly gets very personal so that they'll see in his story how hard this really is. Let's look at him. But I need something more. For if I know the law but still can't keep it, and if the power of sin within me keeps sabotaging my best intentions, I obviously need help. He's not talking about anybody else. He's talking about Paul. I can't do it. I realize that I don't have what it takes. I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad, and then I do it anyway. Can you feel the anxiety in him? My decisions, such as they are, don't result in actions. Something's gone wrong deep within me and gets the better of me every time. It happens so regularly that it's predictable. The moment I decide to do good, sin is there to trip me up. I truly delight in God's commands, but it's pretty obvious that not all of me joins in that delight. I want to do the right, I don't do it. Parts of me covertly rebel, and just when I least expect it, they take charge. I've tried everything and nothing helps. I'm at the end of my rope. Is there no one who can do anything for me? Isn't that the real question? The answer, thank God, is Jesus Christ can and does. He acted to set things right in this life of contradictions where I want to serve God with all my heart and mind, but I'm pulled by the influence of sin to do something totally different. This is really rough, but it's a fundamental truth. We are not in control of ourselves. We can't do it. Paul, who maybe could get the nomination for the greatest follower of Jesus Christ ever, in his own life, he doesn't give us the detail of what these things are that are his sins that pull him apart, but he says, I can't do it. Look again at some of his words. Obviously need help. I realize that I don't have what it takes. I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad. That's what I do. My decisions, such as they are, don't result in action. Who here knows what he's talking about? I do. I want to do the right thing over here. And then this little, what shall we call it? Temptation? Enticement? Possibility? Tease? Well, you see me right back over here. And worse yet, it doesn't just tease or entice me. It takes hold of me. Tears into me. We've all got them. Let's start with that bottom line today. Every single person in this room's got the things that tear away at you. There's a great piece by the wonderful Christian writer C.S. Lewis, an illustration of his story, The Great Divorce, up on the screen. This is by a guy named Christopher Barrick. And that larger figure in the illustration, that's an angelic figure. And the other one, well, the angel describes him in the story as the ghost of a man. And the angel is walking through this darkened world, and he sees this strange figure walking toward him, and he realizes it's the ghost of a man, and on his shoulder, on the ghost's shoulder is, well, it's a red lizard. And it has sunk its claws into his flesh, such as it is, his ghostly flesh. And its mouth is even gnawing at the man's neck. The angel's stunned by this. And so he says to the man, do you want me to get rid of that? I can kill it. And the man goes through a series of responses, and I want to share them with you because they're illustrative of all the responses that I think you and I tend to go through. The man first says, oh no, don't bother. That's not a big deal. The thing's gnawing at his flesh. It's tearing him apart. No, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. It is, says the angel. I can kill it. What are the things that, not my flesh, and I like to pretend they're not a big deal? I can list those. The angel doesn't let the ghost get away with this, and he says, I'll kill it. And the man says, really, I can live with this. Just silence it for me. Because every once in a while, it will let out a screech. And then this thing, which normally people don't notice, everybody sees it. And then I'm humiliated. In other words, don't get rid of my sin. Just hide it for me. Been there, done that. Well, let me think about it, says the man. This is his next attempt. Let me have a good long discussion with you about this thing on my shoulder that's chewing at my neck. Let's talk it through, and we'll talk about it, and we'll discuss it, and talk about it, and we'll discuss it. And the angel cuts him off and says, no. I can either kill it or not. But I won't talk about it. Now the man's getting a little anxious, but he says, hey, look, it's being silent right now. As a matter of fact, it looks like he's gone to sleep. See, I can control it. It's okay if it's up there. I've got a handle on it. How many of us can think about the things in our lives that we say to ourselves, I've got a handle on this one. And we think we've got a handle on it, and maybe we've got a handle on it for a week or 2 years, and then suddenly, bang, it's right back there and it's grabbed hold of us. We can list those too. And so the man, now getting really anxious, because the angel says to him, you can't control it, but I can kill it. The man getting really anxious says, look, tell you what I'll do. You're right, I got to get rid of this. I know I've got to get rid of it. So here's what we'll do. I want you to peel back one claw, just one claw. We'll see how painful that is. And, if it's not too painful, well, then maybe a few months or a year from now, we can try peeling back another claw, right? Oh, yeah, I'll change, but not too much. Look, I can either rip it off, says the angel, and kill it, or not. It'll hurt, says the man. I know it's going to hurt. Now, clearly anxious, he says, I know it's going to hurt me terribly. Yes. The angel throws his hand on the red lizard. This will hurt. And he begins to pull, and the man screams out, I'm going to die. If I lose this, I'm going to die. I just know I'm going to die. Help me. Somebody, don't do it. Help me. When everything else fails, fear can lock us into our sins. And then at one point, the man finally breaks. And instead of crying, don't do it, somebody help me, he cries, God, help me. Do it. And the angel rips it off his flesh, breaks the back of it in his hand, and throws it down on the turf. There's no middle ground with these things that control our lives, that make us into the ghost of the person we're intended to be. And the story actually has kind of a profound and lovely ending. The angel is looking down at this broken bit of evil, rotten, flesh-eating, soul-sucking, demonic sin dead on the turf. And then he looks up at the guy. And he's a ghost no longer, but a whole, healthy, vital man. And that's what's available to us. But the first step is to say very clearly, I'm not in control. That there are, take your name for them, addictions, demons, bad habits, sins that run my life for me. And I get sucked into them again and again and again. And once we get there, we can even begin to see, I think, how deeply this goes. As Paul's wrestling with this, he talks about that. He lets the world know, wow, this really cuts to the heart of me. He realizes that he is, you are, all of us are, intrinsically born fallible. That's a great word, I think. Comes from a French theologian named Paul Ricoeur. And Paul Ricoeur simply points out that each and every human being is born with some part of us that just doesn't work right. We're not born evil in his eyes, but at some point in the journey, count on it, this brokenness is going to start showing itself. It's so deep down, we can't even name it or know it completely. Paul said that 2,000 years before Ricoeur. Look at what he says again. Something has gone wrong deep within me and gets the better of me every time. Not once in a while, every time. I think I've got it, and it comes back and haunts me again and makes a ghost out of me. Every time. I was reading, as some of you know, I'm a bit of a nerd. I'm a lot of a nerd, actually. And so I was reading a little piece in a magazine called Smithsonian about some biology that's been happening the last 10 years. It's about genetic biology and the sequencing of the human genome. And they know some basics. They know that when chromosomes, show a picture of the chromosomes up there, when they divide and a cell divides, you get two perfectly new set of chromosomes. They've always known that. But as they were doing the human genome sequencing process, they came to a remarkable conclusion that the very tips of each chromosome, the one part marked in pink, it's called the telomere. Everything else divides and you get a completely brand new one made, but those telomeres, they divide in half. So every time a cell divides and old cells die and a new one's made, the telomeres get shorter. They've looked at babies, their telomeres are really long. Looked at people in their 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and they're really short. One scientist said, it's as if we've discovered that every human being is born with an expiration date. Now, this is fascinating science, just the sort of thing that the geek inside of me loves to read about. And then I'm reading along about this, and they're doing all sorts of scientific work to see if they can lengthen and restore telomeres, and maybe that'll be a key to longer lives, and who knows, maybe even physical immortality. And they've tried genetic splicing, they've tried designer medications, they've tried this thing or that thing, and then they started studying what causes telomeres to shorten. Well, some of it was obvious. Poor nutrition, right? Lack of vitamins, lack of rest. But you know what causes the number one quickest degradation of this thing, which is your expiration date? Violent, stress-filled, hateful emotions and activities. If you bully someone, they shorten quick. If you've been bullied, they shorten quick. They couldn't believe how that would connect with genetics, but it did. So they started doing some more tests, and guess what? If you live in a healthy household where love is the foundation, where violence is absent, where people are treated with dignity and respect, they hardly degrade at all. 21st century science tells us a simple fact, that we are wired to fall apart when we live in sin. That's what I read. It goes that deep. Which leaves us with a profound question. What are we going to do about this? I've got the lizard right here. I know I'm not the only one in this room with that lizard. How am I going to get rid of it? Well, the first lesson is it's not about what I do. It's about what God does. Paul nails it at the end. You want to get things set right in your life? It's only through God and Jesus Christ. Listen again to his final words coming up on the screen. He, that is God through Christ, acted to set things right in this life of contradictions where I want to serve God with all my heart and mind, but am pulled away by the influence of, and there it is, we're going to name it now, it's sin. To do something totally different. It's sin that pulls us away from God. It's sin that breaks our relationships. It's sin that is the root of cruelty. It's sin that tears at our flesh and our spirits and makes us a ghost of the person God intended us to be. It's our sin that makes us out of control. And only God and Jesus Christ, not anything we do, but throwing our lives on God and Jesus Christ brings us back into control. And the stories throughout history of people who have been down there at the bottom and who've put it back together, not through their own power, but through God's power, well, they go on and on and on. Here's one I learned recently. It's becoming a favorite of mine. It's about a woman named Betty Jo living in Kansas City. She got hooked back in the 70s when she was younger into drugs, broke off her relationship with her family of origin, never built a family of her own. Betty Jo hit rock bottom back in the early 2000s, to the point where she was even, involved in prostitution in order to fulfill her drug habit. And then, a few years ago, somebody who was a street missionary sat and talked with her about Jesus Christ, shared the gospel with her, and she decided to believe. She got back with her family of origin, reconnected with her mother, who was terminally ill, and though their relationship was short, just a few months, Betty Jo and her mother built a fabulous relationship. And when she died, her mother left her a nice sum of money. And Betty Jo knew what she was going to do with that. She bought a house. Oh, she didn't buy it for herself. She went back into the terrible neighborhood that she'd been living in. She bought an old rundown house there, fixed it up, and made it into a halfway home of sorts for anybody who's living on the streets and who doesn't have a home. Addicted to drugs? Go to her first house. When it filled up, she said, we need a second one. So she went down the block. There was an old home that crack addicts used to use as a place to hang out. Meth addicts used to use. She said, well, I'm going to buy that one. She didn't have any money, so she started going around to churches in town. She went to the biggest church in town. It's pastored by a guy named Adam Hamilton, Church of the Resurrection. Adam Hamilton, speaking about Betty Jo, said, she showed up one day and said, I need you to buy me a house. By the time she left, I said to myself, I need to buy her a house. He went on and said, whenever Betty Jo shows up, I know I'm going to be physically poorer, but spiritually richer. So another house got filled up. Well, we better start thinking bigger, Betty Jo said. So she went out and bought an apartment building. The apartment building got filled up. And then a couple of years ago, a man showed up and he says, I know you've created all these wonderful homes for women, but I'm telling you, I've been fighting this on my own. I can't do it. There's just no possibility. How about letting me live here? She said, there's a reason why I keep the men and women separate. There's just going to be an issue. This home is not for men. Which left her with no other alternative. She went out and bought another house. In 7 years, she has bought, rehabbed 7 different homes in Kansas City, including that apartment building. And people living on the streets, people who have been lost in drugs, people whose lives are broken and shattered because of the sin that has encapsulated them, well, they're renewed. And the lesson to learn from this that is so simple but clear is that if you want to be renewed, it's not about controlling yourself. It's about letting God control you. And next week, we're going to talk about that battle too. Amen.